Breakthrough in Hunt for college-age suspect in Charlie Kirk shooting. Welcome to Behind the Crime, where true crime meets real life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Let's uncover the truth, one case at a time. Now let's see today's story. At 12:20 p.m. on a Wednesday in early September, the packed auditorium at Utah Valley University was alive with the nervous energy that often followed Charlie Kirk onto a stage. 3,000 students, faculty, and community members had gathered in Orem, Utah, to see the 31-year-old conservative activist in action. For nearly a decade, Kirk had made his name on exactly this kind of stage. He thrived on confrontation, sought out audiences that would challenge him, and built a following by inviting ideological combat. That afternoon's event, titled Prove Me Wrong, was structured around audience members stepping up to a microphone to ask difficult questions. The conversation, like many of Kirk's public appearances, turned quickly to guns. Do you know how many transgender Americans have been mass shooters over the last 10 years? A student asked. Kirk paused only briefly before answering, too many. The questioner responded with his own statistic, 5 in a decade. He pressed Kirk on how that compared to mass shootings overall. Counting or not counting gang violence? Kirk shot back. The exchange was brisk, pointed, and characteristic of the confrontational style Kirk had long cultivated. Then came a single, sharp crack, a sound out of place in a lecture hall but instantly recognizable to many in the audience. The crowd froze for a beat. Then panic erupted. Kirk staggered, a red bloom spreading across his shirt at the collar. He had been hit in the neck. Eyewitnesses later described the moment as unreal, an intrusion of violence into what was supposed to be a contest of ideas. Students screamed, ducked, and surged toward the exits. Some dropped to the ground, others climbed over chairs. Security officers rushed to the stage, dragging Kirk backward as they tried to assess the wound. The audience, many of them barely out of their teens, stampeded toward doors and stairwells in a scene that quickly descended into confusion and fear. "It's scary," student Brock Anderson told the BBC in the hours after. "It's unsettling around the campus right now." Within minutes, campus police had sealed off the building. But the shooter was already gone. Investigators would later reconstruct the gunman's path. According to surveillance footage and eyewitness accounts, he arrived on campus at 11:52 a.m., blending easily into the midday crowds of students hurrying between classes. He was described as slim, young, with dark hair. He wore a black t-shirt and a baseball cap, attire that drew no attention on a college campus. Officials later said he appeared to be of college age, a vague descriptor that nonetheless captured the unnerving possibility. He looked like he belonged there. Rather than enter the auditorium through the main doors, the suspect had moved through stairwells, climbing toward a vantage point above the event. At some point, he reached a rooftop position, crossed to a spot with line of sight into the hall, and waited. At 12:20, less than half an hour after arriving, he fired a single shot. Then, in a move that suggested both preparation and recklessness, he leapt from the building and fled. That evening, federal agents and state investigators combed the wooded perimeter of the campus. Just off a trail, wrapped in a towel, they recovered what they believe was the weapon, a Mauser .30-06 bolt-action rifle, imported and decades old. Alongside it, investigators found a palm print and a footwear impression. The items were carefully photographed, collected, and sent for forensic analysis. At a press conference the following day, FBI Special Agent in Charge Robert Bowles announced the discovery. The rifle, he said, was believed to be the weapon used to kill Kirk. The FBI had released images of the person of interest, and the Bureau was offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to his identification and arrest. Despite the dramatic nature of the crime, Bowles emphasized that authorities did not believe the wider community was at risk. The shooter, he said, had targeted Kirk specifically. The shooting reverberated quickly beyond Orem. Within hours, national networks interrupted programming for breaking news updates. Local stations carried live coverage from outside the campus, showing crowds of evacuated students waiting anxiously to retrieve their cars and backpacks. Utah Governor Spencer Cox condemned the act as a political assassination. In Washington, White House officials briefed President Donald Trump, who himself had survived 2 recent attempts on his life. By nightfall, the outlines of the tragedy were becoming clearer. Kirk, gravely wounded, had been rushed to a local hospital. Despite frantic efforts, he was pronounced dead hours later. He left behind a wife, Erica, a 1-year-old son, and a 3-year-old daughter. On Kirk's X account, with its 5.6 million followers, a memorial post appeared that evening. It hailed him as America's greatest martyr to the freedom of speech he so adored. The Post noted that Kirk had endured thousands of threats during his career, but had continued to speak his mind. Now, the account said he had paid the ultimate price for his commitment to expression. For supporters, the language resonated. Kirk was not simply a victim of violence, but a casualty of America's bitter ideological conflict. For critics, the immediate framing raised concerns about further inflaming a polarized nation. Either way, the shooting of Charlie Kirk was not just another crime. It was a political act, carried out in a moment of national instability, with implications that stretched far beyond a single university campus in Utah. By Thursday morning, the focus had shifted to the hunt. At a press conference, officials displayed surveillance stills of the suspect. A young man, slim in a black t-shirt and cap, his face partly obscured but visible enough to spark calls from those who might recognize him. The FBI set up tip lines, and investigators traced his movements across campus before and after the shooting. They knew when he arrived. They knew where he had positioned himself. But his escape route remained uncertain. Commissioner Bo Mason of the Utah Department of Public Safety described the suspect as someone who blended well into the campus environment. That detail, that he could walk among students unnoticed, added to the anxiety. Was he a student? An outsider who had studied the campus layout? Someone with personal animus toward Kirk? Investigators did not yet have answers. As the search intensified, national leaders turned the tragedy into a stage for broader reflection. Vice President J.D. Vance, a close friend of Kirk, and Second Lady Usha Vance flew to Salt Lake City on Thursday to accompany Kirk's coffin. Air Force Two would carry it, along with Kirk's family and friends, back to his hometown in Arizona. The trip was unplanned. The Vances had originally been scheduled to visit Ground Zero in New York for the 24th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Instead, they diverted west, standing by as Kirk's coffin was loaded aboard the aircraft. At the Pentagon, President Trump addressed a memorial service for 9/11 victims. But reporters noted a change. Instead of speaking outside as planned, he spoke in the safety of the courtyard. The adjustment, CBS News reported, was made out of caution. Kirk's killer was still at large. After the ceremony, Trump expressed his condolences. "You don't replace a Charlie Kirk," he said. "He's unique, as you all know." He added that he planned to award Kirk the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously, the nation's highest civilian honor. As vigils began near Utah Valley University and Kirk supporters gathered online, the same question circulated. Why? Why Kirk and why here? Was it a targeted act of political violence, as Governor Cox suggested? A personal vendetta? An attack meant to send a message? For investigators, the questions remained open. What they had was evidence. A rifle, a palm print, a shoe impression, and images of a young man moving calmly across a campus before slipping away into anonymity. For the thousands who had filled the auditorium that afternoon, the memory was simpler. One moment they were engaged in the back and forth of political argument, and the next, their world was shattered by the sound of a single shot. When news broke of Charlie Kirk's death, the shock was immediate, but so too was recognition. The 31-year-old had long been one of the most visible and polarizing figures on the American right. For supporters, he was a fearless advocate for free speech, an organizer who brought conservative politics to campuses across the country. For critics, he was a provocateur who thrived on outrage and confrontation. To understand why his killing sent shockwaves through American politics, one has to look back at the improbable trajectory that carried him from suburban Illinois to the national stage. Charlie Kirk was born in 1993 in Arlington Heights, Illinois, and raised in the nearby town of Prospect Heights. His father, Robert, was an architect. His mother, Barbara, worked as a mental health counselor. From an early age, Kirk exhibited an appetite for argument. Teachers remembered him as sharp and talkative, sometimes to a fault. Friends described a teenager fascinated by politics, especially debates around economics and government. He attended Wheeling High School, a public school northwest of Chicago. By his senior year, Kirk was already writing political commentary. In 2012, as a teenager, he contributed an essay to Breitbart News that criticized what he saw as liberal bias in school curricula. That same year, he attended the Republican National Convention in Tampa, Florida. He was just 18, but the experience crystallized his ambitions. While other young people his age were preparing for college, Kirk was beginning to imagine a different path. In 2012, with encouragement from conservative donors and activists, Kirk co-founded Turning Point USA. The group's mission was straightforward: to organize young conservatives on college campuses, where liberal ideas had long dominated. Starting from scratch, Kirk built Turning Point into a powerful presence. The organization recruited student activists, organized speaking events, and promoted free market and small government principles. Its distinctive graphics, including the red and white TPUSA logo, became familiar on campuses nationwide. By 2016, Turning Point claimed chapters on hundreds of campuses and a budget in the millions. Its annual Student Action Summit drew thousands of young conservatives and featured top Republican politicians. Kirk, often in a tailored suit and clutching a microphone, became the group's face. He was young, energetic, and unapologetically combative. Kirk's rise coincided with the ascent of Donald Trump. While many young conservatives initially hesitated to embrace Trump's brash style, Kirk leaned in. He became one of the then candidate's most vocal defenders on television and social media. Trump noticed. By 2018, Kirk was a regular guest at the White House, and Turning Point events frequently featured Trump family members. He cultivated a close relationship with Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump. For Kirk, Trump represented both a model and a platform. Someone who thrived on controversy, fought cultural battles as much as policy ones, and found success by refusing to apologize. This alignment propelled Kirk into the spotlight. His Twitter account, later X, swelled to millions of followers. He became a fixture on cable news and podcasts, invited to spar with opponents and rally supporters. But visibility came with backlash. Critics accused Kirk of stoking division, amplifying conspiracy theories, and spreading misinformation. He was banned temporarily from some platforms during content moderation crackdowns. On campuses, his appearances often drew protests. Student groups denounced him as a provocateur who courted attention by inflaming sensitive debates on race, gender, and immigration. For Kirk, the criticism reinforced his narrative. He cast himself as a warrior for free speech, silenced not by lack of ideas but by opponents who feared debate. That framing resonated with his base, particularly among students who felt alienated by progressive campus culture. For them, Kirk was not simply a speaker but a champion of their worldview. With prominence came risk. Over the years, Kirk reported receiving thousands of threats. Turning Point USA increased its security at events, often coordinating with campus police. Kirk was unfazed. In interviews, he described the threats as proof of his effectiveness. If his opponents were angry enough to try to silence him, he argued, then he was doing something right. Still, the hostility was real. At some campuses, events had to be canceled due to safety concerns. At others, they proceeded under heavy police presence. The atmosphere reinforced a sense of siege. Kirk against the world, defending free speech against those who would shut him down. Away from the stage, Kirk was quieter. In 2021, he married Erica Franceva, a podcaster and former Miss Arizona. Together they had 2 children, a daughter born in 2022 and a son born in 2024. Friends described him as deeply committed to his family, often flying home between events to spend time with them. He spoke publicly about his Christian faith and the importance of raising children with strong values. Balancing family life with public life was never simple. Kirk traveled constantly, often addressing multiple campus events in a single week. But he presented himself as both a public warrior and a private family man, a dual identity that resonated with supporters who saw him as embodying conservative ideals. By September 2025, Kirk was well into his second decade of public life. Turning Point USA was firmly established, with chapters in all 50 states. He had written books, launched a daily radio show, and built a digital empire across podcasts and video platforms. The Utah Valley University event was part of a nationwide tour, designed to bring him directly to students. The Prove Me Wrong format, which invited audience members to challenge him, was emblematic of his style: confrontational, unfiltered, and high risk. To Kirk, that risk was the point. Free speech means you go into the arena, and you face the toughest questions, he said in an earlier interview. If you can't handle that, you shouldn't be speaking at all. On the stage in Orem, he was doing exactly that when the bullet struck. Kirk's death was not simply the loss of an individual. For many, it symbolized the dangers of political polarization in the United States. To supporters, he became a martyr for speech, killed while defending the principle that ideas should be contested openly. To detractors, his death raised uncomfortable questions about the escalating rhetoric and hostility that defined American politics. In either case, the symbolism was inescapable. A man who had built his career on campuses, who had challenged opponents to prove him wrong, was killed on one of those very stages in front of thousands of students. As investigators pursued the suspect and Kirk's coffin traveled home on Air Force Two, the narrative of his life intertwined with the circumstances of his death. The boy from suburban Illinois who had once written an essay for Breitbart had become a national figure, admired and reviled but impossible to ignore. He had thrived in confrontation, insisting that young conservatives deserved a place at the table. Now, in the wake of his killing, the nation was left to reckon with both his influence and the forces that had conspired, in one moment of violence, to cut his life short. By Thursday morning, less than 24 hours after the shooting, the image of the suspect was everywhere. A slim, dark-haired young man in a baseball cap and black t-shirt. The FBI circulated the security stills widely, urging the public to study them closely. The photos were grainy, but they captured enough. A profile, a stance, the cut of his clothes. Investigators described him as college age, an unsettling phrase for the thousands of Utah Valley University students who suddenly found themselves wondering if the shooter had been sitting in their classes, walking their sidewalks, or eating in their cafeterias. The Bureau moved quickly. Tip lines were opened. Social media posts spread the images far beyond Utah. Local police canvassed the area around the university, interviewing witnesses, pulling surveillance footage from nearby businesses, and following up on leads. They had more than just pictures. The recovery of the Mauser rifle in a wooded area near the scene gave forensic teams a head start. Wrapped in a towel, the weapon carried not just ballistics evidence but also a palm print. Nearby, a footwear impression was documented, not as distinctive as a fingerprint, but potentially enough to link a suspect to the scene. "We believe this was the firearm used in the killing," Special Agent in Charge Robert Bowles told reporters at a news conference. His remarks carried a dual message: confidence in the evidence gathered, and an acknowledgement that the suspect remained at large. The FBI announced a $100,000 reward for information leading to the identification and arrest of the shooter. For federal investigators, the money was a way to accelerate the flow of tips, to shake loose memories and suspicions in a community on edge. Commissioner Bo Mason of the Utah Department of Public Safety sought to balance transparency with reassurance. He told the public that authorities did not believe there was an ongoing risk to the broader community. The individual blended well into the campus environment, Mason said. The remark underscored the difficulty of the case. The suspect had managed to arrive, position himself, and escape without triggering suspicion. But it also conveyed a message of calm, an attempt to prevent panic among students and residents. Still, unease lingered. Students who had fled the auditorium the day before now spoke of their reluctance to return. Parents called campus officials demanding updates on safety protocols. Faculty postponed classes. The image of a young man with a rifle on a rooftop had unsettled more than a university, it had unsettled an entire state. The shooting's political implications emerged immediately. Utah Governor Spencer Cox described the killing as a political assassination, a phrase that placed Kirk's death in the lineage of American violence against public figures. In Washington, the atmosphere was somber. The attack occurred on September 10th, on the eve of the 24th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. President Donald Trump had been scheduled to deliver remarks outside the Pentagon the following day. Instead, officials quietly moved the event indoors, citing security concerns while the shooter remained at large. At the memorial service, Trump spoke about resilience in the face of terror, but reporters noted that his comments turned quickly to Kirk. "You don't replace a Charlie Kirk," he said. "He's unique, as you all know." The president later announced his intention to award Kirk the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously. The decision underscored Kirk's significance in the conservative movement and elevated his death from tragedy to national event. Vice President J.D. Vance, a close ally of Kirk's, canceled his planned visit to New York and instead flew to Salt Lake City with his wife, Usha. Together, they joined Kirk's family in overseeing the transport of his coffin. On Thursday evening, the flag-draped casket was loaded onto Air Force Two. The aircraft, usually reserved for official travel, carried Kirk home to Arizona. Alongside his widow and children, friends, and colleagues, the journey became a symbolic act, the federal government bearing one of its own back to his community. The decision to use Air Force Two was unusual, but it reflected both Kirk's political stature and the sense of national loss. For supporters, it was a recognition of his influence. For others, it was a stark reminder of how intertwined politics and tragedy had become. In the days following the shooting, tributes poured in from across the conservative spectrum. Talk radio hosts dedicated segments to Kirk's legacy. Governors and senators issued statements of condolence. At vigils near the Utah Valley University campus, students lit candles and placed flowers. Some held signs quoting Kirk's slogans about free speech. Others, less familiar with his politics, came simply to honor the fact that a guest on their campus had been gunned down while speaking. The rhetoric of martyrdom intensified online. On Kirk's X account, administrators posted a message declaring him America's greatest martyr to the freedom of speech he so adored. The phrasing was deliberate, framing his death as not just personal tragedy but as a symbolic strike against the principle of open dialogue. But not all responses followed that script. Commentators across the political spectrum expressed concern that the language surrounding Kirk's death risked further inflaming a divided nation. The fear was that his killing would not only mourn a life but also deepen hostility. Behind the public mourning, investigators pressed on. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to assess the suspect's profile. Was he politically motivated, as many suspected? Or was the act rooted in personal grievance, mental illness, or other factors? Forensic teams examined the palm print from the rifle. They compared the footwear impression to databases of known shoe patterns, a process that could narrow possibilities but rarely produced definitive answers on its own. Agents interviewed students and staff who had been near the auditorium that day. They traced the suspect's path on security cameras, piecing together a timeline that showed his arrival, movements, and escape. Each detail added to a picture, but none yet revealed identity. The suspect remained a shadow, present in evidence, absent from arrest. The killing of Charlie Kirk reignited a conversation already simmering in American life: the rise of political violence. The United States had experienced a string of high-profile incidents in recent years, from attempts on the lives of public officials to mass shootings in politically charged settings. Kirk's death fit into that grim pattern, raising questions about whether the nation was entering a new era of normalized political bloodshed. Historians pointed to echoes of the 1960s and 1970s, when assassinations and attempted assassinations had shaken the political order. But today's context, a polarized media environment, amplified by social networks, made the danger different. Kirk had been both a beneficiary and a casualty of that environment. He had built his career on the amplification of controversy, and now he had fallen victim to its violent edge. Amid the politics and investigation, the human dimension remained. Erica Kirk, widowed at 29, faced the task of raising 2 children without their father. Their daughter was 3, their son not yet 2. In statements released through Turning Point USA, the family described Kirk as a devoted husband and father, a man who traveled frequently but always returned home to be present with his children. Friends organized fundraisers to support the family. Colleagues shared anecdotes of Kirk pausing meetings to video call his children. In these recollections, the image of the fiery public speaker softened into that of a young father whose life had been cut short. Kirk's killing forced institutions to re-evaluate. Universities, already struggling with security around controversial speakers, faced new scrutiny. Could they guarantee safety at public events? Should they continue hosting figures whose presence drew both supporters and threats? Law enforcement agencies confronted their own challenge, preventing politically motivated violence in an era of heightened rhetoric. The difficulty was not just in stopping attacks but in distinguishing between heated speech and genuine threats. For politicians, the dilemma was sharper still. How to condemn violence without weaponizing it? How to honor Kirk without inflaming tensions further? Weeks after the shooting, one fact remained unchanged: the suspect was unidentified. Despite evidence, images, and a reward, the young man in the black cap had not been found. That absence hung over every vigil, every political speech, every family statement. It was a reminder that the story was unfinished, that the act of violence that had shocked the nation still lacked resolution. Was the shooter motivated by ideology? By personal animosity? By mental illness? Until he was identified, speculation filled the gap. On the campus of Utah Valley University, the auditorium where Kirk had spoken remained closed for weeks. Students passed by quietly, some leaving flowers, others avoiding the building altogether. The stairwells and rooftops were inspected, secured, and monitored. But the memory of the violence lingered. For those who had been in the crowd, the sound of the gunshot was not easily forgotten. In the absence of answers, the event became a symbol. For some, it was a symbol of free speech under attack. For others, a warning about the consequences of escalating rhetoric. And for Kirk's family, it was simply the place where a husband and father had been taken from them. The braided threads of Charlie Kirk's story, his rise, his killing, and the hunt for his assailant, wove together into a narrative larger than any single life. He had begun as a teenager with a passion for politics, built a national organization, and became a central figure in America's cultural battles. He had thrived on confrontation, insisting that free speech required courage. And in the end, he had been killed while exercising that very principle, standing before thousands, answering hard questions, challenging opponents to prove him wrong. The investigation continues. The suspect remains at large. The questions of motive, responsibility, and meaning hang unresolved. But one fact is beyond dispute. In September 2025, in an auditorium in Orem, Utah, the sound of a single shot echoed across a divided nation, leaving behind grief, fear, and a reminder of the fragility of American democracy. Thank you for staying through to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel now, and also feel free to comment and make a suggestion about anything or any story of your interest.